Hello everyone, my name is Edward Pabi, and in this video we are going to be looking at combinators in CSS. So what is a combinator? So a combinator explains the relationship between listed selectors. It actually, in mere words, I would say that it actually allows you to target elements based on their relationship in HTML. So in this video, we'll be looking at four of them. That is the descendant combinator, which is a space, the child combinator, which is the greater than sign, the adjacent sibling, which is the plus, and the general sibling, which is the child. So one thing about CSS coordinators that you need to know is that they come with a general rule like this. A selector, for example, a selector, then the combinator comes in. So we pick the child combinator, then another selector. So for example, if I have a div, then a child combinator, which is the greater than sign, to a p element, that is a paragraph element. What it means is that I am going to, so for every p element inside the div, it is going to select it and you add a styling property to it. So let's head over to our HTML document. So in our HTML document, you could see that I created a div with an ID container, and in that div there are h2 elements in that div, and I created an inner div inside the div with the ID container, and that inner div has an inner h2 element inside. Then outside the div with the ID container, I have the h2 element there. I created three h2 elements. So um this h2 element, which is outside the div id container, is acting as a sibling to the div id container, because both the div id container and the h2 elements here are inside the body. So for instance, you can say that the body is like the parent and it has children, or it has two children, that is the div with the id container and the h2 element here. So that means that these three h2 elements are acting as siblings, as a sibling to um the div with the id container. And inside the div with the id container is the h2 element. They are acting like a child to the div with the id container. And let me say, I would say that the inner div could even be maybe the h2 element inside the inner div could be like a grandchildren to the first h2 element. So for us to be clear that this whole thing is inside the div with the id container. For example, the number one, number two, number three, number four, you can see on our HTML document here, they are all inside a div with the id container. So let's create a border for it. Let's put them in, let's create a border so we can, you know, differentiate that this category are inside. It can be clear that they are in the div with the id container section. So let's go. So let's create, so I'll take my container. So container, then I have my I add my CSS. So let's put it in a border. So border, we make border um 2 pixels, and make it solid. Yeah, correct. So here it shows that the element inside the div with the id container is truly inside the div section. So it's clear now. So let's head over to the descendant combinator. So what does the descendant combinator does? So the descendant combinator works like saying you are finding something inside something else. So for example, with the descendant combinator, it actually allows you to select all the elements, all the h, for instance, if you want to select all the h2 elements inside the div with the id container, you are going to use the descendant elements. From the word descendant, it can mean like children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, great grandchildren. And you could see that, as I said earlier on, that this h2 tags here is acting as a child, sorry, a child to the div with the id container, and this one is acting like a grandchild to the div with the id container. So what the descendant coordinate combinator does is that it actually gives you the ability to what, to select, to add a styling, to add a style to a styling property to the h2 element found in this div with the id container. So let's do something. So we take our container, then space, because I said earlier on, descendant combinator is a space. Then after the space, we bring our selector, the other selector, that is the element which we want to apply the styling to. So we want to apply the styling to all h2 elements. Then we open our bracket. Then we apply any font styling method, any styling method. So let's use the background color. So let's use background color. So background color, let's make it maybe blue. Yes. So when we look at our HTML document here, we could realize that all the h2 element found inside the div with the id container is being has been styled with a background color of blue, and that's what, and you can see that they are already in the coordinator. Hey, they are already in a container, as you can see, which is rounded by a border. So let's move to the next one, which is the child combinator. So what the child combinator does is that the child combinator picks only the elements that are directly under the parent. So for instance, if you want to select all h2 elements inside the div with the id container using the child combinator, it is only going to select only these three, one, two, three, because I said earlier on that this div which has an h2 element number 4 is not a child to the div with the id container, but it can be a descendant. So a descendant, sorry, a child can be a descendant, but a descendant cannot be a child. So with a child combinator property is going to apply to these three, because these three h2 elements here are just direct. The keyword here is direct. They are just direct to the div with the id container, whereas this one is not direct. So let's see what will happen using the child combinator. So we take our container, then we open, sorry, then how I said earlier on that the child coordinator actually has, is a caret, sorry, it's a greater than sign. So we bring our greater than sign, then we state the selector, that is the element which we want to style, that is all h2 elements that are direct to the container. Then we open our bracket. Then let's add background. Let's make it a background color. Let's make it red. Yes, and this is it. So you realize that it will only what select the three elements because you are using the child combinator. What it does is that you only select the elements that are direct to the parent element. So let's move to the next one, which is the adjacent sibling. So the adjacent sibling actually looks like uh, the next door neighbor of an element. So as I said earlier on that this div and the H2 elements here are inside the body. So that means that they are going to act as siblings. So for instance, if you want to use the adjacent sibling, what the adjacent sibling will do is that it will actually select the next element after another element. So it will select the next element after another element. So this whole div id container is an element, and the next element is the h2 element. So it is going to select the next element just immediately after another element, which is the div id container. So this adjacent sibling is going to select the one that is immediate after, or the one that is next. It's going to select the first one that is next to the other element. So it is going to select the number 5. So let's see how it's going to be like. So we take our container. So our container, then we said that the adjacent sibling comes with a plus. Then we define, or we state our element we want to add a styling to, that is the h2 element. uh then we open our bracket, and we say this time let's make the background color green. So background color, let's make it green. Okay, so you could see that the adjacent sibling actually is going to select only the immediate element after another element. So it's going to select the immediate and first element after the div id, the div with the id container. So let's head over to the last example of the combinator, that is the general sibling. So I always say that the general sibling actually acts opposite to the adjacent sibling. So with the adjacent sibling, you recall that it actually selects the elements immediate after another element. So with the adjacent sibling, when we have used the adjacent sibling, it selected only the first H2 element, that is the number 5. And we added a CSS styling property, which is the background to be green. But with the general sibling, what it does is that it doesn't select only the first element after another element, which is the div id container, but it selects all the other siblings or all the other elements after, that is found after the another element, or that is found after our div with the id container. So let's go on to see how it works. So with the general sibling, we said that it is a child. So we take our container, then the general sibling combinator, which is the child. Then we actually state our element that we want to apply our CSS styling to, that is the H2 element. So we want to apply all the H2 elements that are found after the div with the id container. So we go on to add a styling property, which is the background. Let's make it background color. Let's make it maybe yellow, so we see how it is. And this is what we have. So you realize that with the general sibling combinator, it selects all the siblings or all the elements that are just after our div with the id container, and this is the output of it. So it has selected the number 5, number 6, number 7 of the each two elements that is acting as a sibling to the div with the id container. So that is all for CSS Combinators. Thank you for watching.